Hello and welcome to another Polestar Pilates Hour. This is the second one of the year. Last week we had a chance for me to be a little selfish and talk about my hip. And today we are honored to have my dear friend and colleague of many decades now, Eric Franklin of the Franklin Method. So Eric, welcome and good to have you back on another Polestar webinar.
Thank you, Brent. It's great to be here.
If anybody's on this webinar that doesn't really know the magnitude of Eric's work, I was going through my cupboards and I was just pulling up some old books and I realized that I had his dynamic alignment through Imagery in German. I mean, I have probably all of your books, Eric. There's probably a whole bookshelf of just Eric Franklin books. But I pulled off the one of Relax and Liberate Your Neck and Shoulders and Conditioning of the Dancer. And all these years, I've been so jealous, Eric. I've wanted to finally be able to have my own book. And as you know, we just finally published my first book, as you know, took me 35 years, but it's okay. I'm coming along.
It's a great book. I've already read half of it and I just have it for 2 days. So it's, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that it reads okay, because we've certainly put all of our energy into it and hoping that it's about how do we make books applicable. And you've done such a good job of making those resources. And of course, we use these books in our curriculum. We recommend everybody to purchase the Dynamic Alignment Through Imagery book that is a classic. We do. It's part of our suggested reading in the Polestar curriculum. So awesome. And today we're going to be talking about dynamic alignment. And I thought maybe what we could do, Eric, is just start off and, the Simon Sinek question of why. Why do we talk about dynamic alignment? And we're going to have to get into the what of it. But I guess first, let's talk about the why. Why dynamic alignment versus static?
Exactly. I mean, I would even start further back with the question, why even, align yourself? Who cares? Well, I would say there's a bunch of good reasons, which we're going to go through this evening. One is, if you want to look more youthful, you probably, want to have a little more upright posture, a little more organized. It just looks better. So that's a good enough reason to start with. But then there's, of course, other ones. For example, gripping and tension. Just put your hand on the back of your neck. And, if you have that forward head, if you, move your head forward, you're just going to feel you're more tense in your neck. So if you have bad posture, you're going to have more tension, more gripping, and less range of motion and less flexibility. So in the Franklin method, we say your flexibility is only as good as your alignment permits. Easy to try that out if you want to stand and just
join him on this.
Down. And then, do a classic slouch posture, pelvis forward, head like this. Now, notice what happened to your shoulder flexibility. A lot less is there. The same with your head. If you lift your leg, notice your hip flexibility. Take your head forward into bad posture. You have less hip flexibility. So flexibility, range of motion, good reasons. But then the reasons we tend not to think of is actually how you perceive the world. We're going to talk about that later on, and also mood. So your mood is related to your posture. So people who tend to be in a bad mood, or they tend to have worse posture, or if you tend to be in worse posture, you tend to have a worse mood. So
I was going to say something, Eric. I remember the first one of the first times that I took a lesson with you. We did that where we went into the slouch posture and we said, smile. And it was like, feel how hard it is to smile, not frown. And feel how easy it is. And then come up in a good posture and smile and see how easy it is versus how,
Exactly.
You think like, wow, that an alignment and posture could actually influence our joy, our, happiness or sadness by just seeing the world differently. And seeing is another big one. I think of all of our senses. When the head and the body is in an aligned position, we see the world completely differently. And we hear the world differently. And we smell the world differently just by making some of those changes.
Exactly. I think
that was a huge gestalt.
So. If you want to experience this, I suggest getting to a bad posture and then saying, I feel great. I feel great. And you notice there's a mismatch. And then if you lift your arms up like that, which automatically lengthens your spine, and you say, I feel lousy, I don't feel good today. Again, it's a mismatch. If you do this, well, you kind of feel good. So it's a feel-good hack. If you ever feel down a little bit,
Change
improve
your
your
posture.
posture, stretch your arms out. So lots of good reasons to have, good alignment. But then, okay, here we have static alignment, and then we have dynamic alignment. So what is the difference? May I maybe briefly speak to that out of my experience as a dancer? So
Absolutely.
if you're a dancer, and I took a lot of ballet classes, it's all about static alignment. This has to be in this position, that has to be in that position. For example, in Vagonova ballet style, you have this square here, the shoulders and the pelvis, they have to be a box and they have to always remain in that position. The problem with that concept is it doesn't work biomechanically. It simply does not work. I'll give you an example with the pelvis, which you may have heard of because of all the teaching I've done in the Pilates world to kind of transfer a little bit into that world. So here you have the pelvis, and you have these bony points here and the pubic symphysis. And I was told this has to be aligned in one plane, right? Then you have is one way of aligning the pelvis. So let's do a little experiment with that. So you stand up, you touch the SS, you touch the pubic symphysis, you kind of imagine those points are all in the same plane, right? Like that. Good. With your fingers on here, lift your leg and notice what happens. You're going to feel this point called the ASIS moving backward. This is going to move back a little bit, the ASIS. You can feel that. That's just natural. That happens also when you walk, which is basically flexing, extending, involves flexing, extending your hip. So you can feel the ASIS going back. Now imagine if you're not allowed to do that. Me as a young dancer, these points have to stay on the same plane as this point down here, like all aligned, statically aligned. And now try to lift your leg, but you're not allowed to move your pelvis. No bony points may move. You literally can't lift your leg, right? Yeah. So it so happens that when you move, you change position. Kind of logical, internally and externally. And humans, they are stable through counterbalancing. When you lift one leg, you have to shift your weight, keep it always over your base of support. So there's no way we can stay in one position when we take the weight of our leg, which is 1/6 of our weight forward. You're going to have changes in your whole body and in your pelvis. That is dynamic alignment. And then building on that, even more in detail, we have the bone rhythms, which we should maybe address afterwards a little bit.
Absolutely. I remember also being in dance class, and we were working on passes and développé and being told that we had to keep that pelvis still while we're doing a passe. And what became funny to me over the decades, and then working primarily with performing artists, was seeing how the dancers all learned how to cheat that actually became professional dancers according to that static posture alignment. Like they could give the resemblance of it, but they were literally moving their pelvis in all positions to be able to get their leg up into a développé. And then when they retired and became the teacher, they went back to teaching the same way they were taught. I think you and I have talked about this as well before, just in IADMs and different dance education meetings. But it was like, how do we, you've done such a good job of evolving the teaching of dance in so many companies that have finally realized that the appearance or the image of what we want to represent on stage requires this dynamic alignment, not static alignment. So exactly. let's continue down that road of, obviously, also in the assessment world, in the physical therapy world, a lot of people look at the static body, the alignment, and say, oh, your feet are pronated, or your knees are valgus, or your knees are recurvatum, or you have a flat spine, or a sway back, or a forward head. And we make decisions off of that. But I've also learned in working with the dance community that they could be standing in the worst posture, and then you ask them to move or to stand up straight, and all of a sudden they get into a very nice and well-balanced posture. And so it was sort of like thinking like, well, is that static posture really giving us as much information as a dynamic posture? So let's go down that road a little bit, Eric, and think of just your experience of, again, differentiating the benefits and what it even means to be looking at dynamic posture.
Well, those are two fabulous points. So you have the dancer who, when they perform, they're obviously going to have to use dynamic alignment, but they think they're using static alignment. And then when they perform, they're doing a good job. They're counterbalancing. That have the bone rhythms going on. They're not fully aware of it. They're just talented. But then when they teach what they heard from their teachers, which is static, but which doesn't work. There's some really good examples of this in dance also, which are more complicated. If you want to be aligned in a pirouette, right? There's only certain positions of your arms that are going to work. And dancers, ballet dancers, are taught to keep their arms kind of in a rounded position like this, like that. But it's very hard or near impossible to turn. So what dancers do is either they take their arms back closer to their center of gravity to stay aligned, or they take their arms down. And they all do that, but they do that only during the turns. And then in the end, they're like this. And if you ask them, do you know what position your arms were in when you were turning? And then they'll show you this position, and then you show them the video. No, they were not.
No, you weren't.
You were doing what is possible from a point of view of alignment, but you're thinking, it's kind of fascinating. And the other point you made also, dancers coming into class, they're all slouched, standing at the bar like that, and then they get ready for class. But here we have a mismatch between habitual posture and professional posture, and that is going to make you less good a performer, because the nervous system is so used to that slouched posture, and then you occasionally, use that performance posture. You have a mismatch there that doesn't really work, because good posture is a habit. It's not a fix. It's not a correction. You can correct someone and put them in good posture, and 5 minutes later, they're back in their habitual posture. So unless you like being in a good posture, you feel comfortable being in good posture, you're not going to be in good posture. You're going to go to your habit.
Well, I remember listening in just some discussions about really understanding, when they did the video Strolling Under the Skin in the myofascial world, and it sort of showed the live fascia and looked like, spider web with honey dripping on it and changing. And then somebody came up, and I can't remember the name of the speaker that talked about it as like a three-dimensional printer, right? So whatever our behavior is how our fascia is adapting. So it started making a lot of sense of somebody who sleeps, on their back and one leg up to the side and the other leg stretched out and their head turned to the side. Why, when they take their first couple steps in the morning, they're sort of walking like that and trying to undo that behavior that they had for 7-8 hours sleeping. And likewise, we're now in a sedentary world. So 80% of our population is sitting 13 hours a day, what the last statistics said, and maybe sleeping 7 hours a night. So as far as load on tissue, in weird behaviors, like we're not really made to be sitting. I mean, we can sit, but that's not really our bipedal behavior as human beings. We start having adaptations. And those adaptations, do change everything from like what you mentioned in the very beginning of things like mood or perception or view of the world. All of those things can be modified. And we know that when we watch like even children developing, if we put a child in a chair for 6 hours a day, and then their recreation is gaming, what have we done? Those behaviors during growth and development phase are going to have a big effect on load in the tissues and posture and alignment and those kind of things that affect so many other parts.
Exactly. And in the Franklin method, we say it doesn't sound very intelligent, but it's still, what it is. You mostly become what you do most of the time, right? So
I quote you on that. We are what we practice.
You have these, exactly. You have these terrific fascia exercises, but mostly you're in this contorted posture in daily life. Well, that's your fascia is going to become your habit. Your habits determine your fascial layout, not the
tissues model the behavior. That's right. Tissue model the behavior.
Exactly.
Hey, I want to switch gears a little bit on this, and just, you're so famous for using imagery and how you defined it, and you've really brought it to the world. We can go back and look at some of the historical idiokinesis and things, but I think one of your talents is making it accessible. I think it's making it very available. Things like the bone rhythms, things about body awareness. I wanted to shift a little bit in what your latest thoughts are on, we use imagery all the time. How do we get that external feedback of the imagery in Pilates and physical therapy, tactile cueing that we might use, but there's still external feedback, videos. How do we get that into an internal feedback for our clients? Because we know that internal feedback is awareness. Like when they can process their own information at an 80% accuracy rate, they're doing fantastic. But most of us don't. So let's talk a little bit about that idea of external feedback into internal feedback, and how you've what your thoughts are now, decades later, of working in imagery in particular of human behavior.
Yeah, well, that's a big question, of course.
I know it is, and I want to dive deep.
Yeah, so working with the mind, body, mind. So, well, the first thing is, I still think, even though we all use imagery to function in daily life, and imagery, memory, very related. If you want to plan for the future or learn from the past, you use imagery, and so everyone's using imagery, but not necessarily using it to their benefit from the point of view of movement and health. And I think using imagery and using mind-body techniques in general is really only possible if you're ready to change your mind, because that's really what it is. It's trying out different minds. Can you imagine apple? Can you imagine banana? No, I can only imagine apple. Well, then it's not going to work, right? And a good spine is one that's constantly lengthening, and there's no damping or force absorption or spring. Yeah. So if you want, that's the first thing, that if you're sort of rigid in your opinion, then you're not ready to try out different things. The second thing is, well, what is imagery? I ask this all the time in classes, and everyone looks at me with big eyes. Well, it's, and usually you get examples, but it's this cool skill we have as humans to generate perceptions in our head that have an effect on how we move and how we feel. So your head is a balloon floating up, your shoulders are melting like ice cream, your head is floating up like a balloon, and your shoulders are dropping and melting down. Some of us will feel an effect from that. Are your shoulders ice cream? No. Is your head a balloon? I hope not. You just generated those perceptions, visual, kinesthetic, whatever, maybe auditory, olfactory, and they had an effect on your body. How cool is that? I think people should be cheering that we can change our state just by generating these, experiences in our mind. Now, talking about alignment and external cues, I was told, for example, to visualize my spine like a pole, and I was supposed to put a stick behind my back like this, right? And then, or stand against a wall. That's a good example. So external information. So the breaking news is, you are not very related to the biomechanics of a wall, to the mechanics of a wall, because it has a completely different function. So, standing as well, I was taught that. I think it still gets taught quite a bit. Yes. That kind of external information doesn't match with your spine, which, as you mentioned in your book, Brent, we're the only, species, whatever, animal with this double S curve and so forth, and it's there for a specific reason, right? We have force absorption, we have proper function of the fascia, needs a lumbar lordosis, and so on. Yeah. So that's the kind of external cueing I got. And the spine, now to talk about using imagery or having props to bring imagery in, the spine functions like a spring. So every time you take a step, there's a little springiness like that, especially for the brain, so your brain doesn't get jolted all the time. But of course, the spring is basically made of counterbalancing curves like this. And all the curves, of course, are going to affect each other. And if you're going to get the instruction, flatten your back like this, and that's an exclusive static thing, there are moments when your back flattens, of course, but if that's the right position you should stay in, that's when you run into trouble. And I can maybe do an example of that, might be interesting, for you have an experience like that. So let's stand up for a moment like this. And yeah, let's lift our legs. So let's notice how flexible are our hips. Yeah, right now. Then put your hand on your lower back And imagine your hand is a wall, and then push your lower back, against the hand, as if you're pushing and flattening your back. So now I have a flat back. And now look what happens to your hip flexibility. Much less, right? So that doesn't mean that you should be sway back. It doesn't mean that there's not moments when your back should be flatter, but it just means if your idea is, I have to have that position, keep that position, and that's the best position, you're going to run into trouble. So the way we teach that is for example, when you bend your legs, when you land from a jump, the spinal curves get a little deeper to absorb force. When you stretch your arms, when you jump up, spinal curves get a little longer. So we have this we call spine dance or spine jumping, where we learn how to allow our spine to change from a more lengthened, flat position to a deeper position. And that's fine, because that's what dynamic is. And if you learn how to do that well through external and internal feedback, through the imagery, through examples, using touch, external feedback, internal imagery, then you're going to start to organize and balance all those curves very nicely.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the essence of the dynamic. And I think where, so many beginning movement teachers get stuck is that they see they can process a static alignment. They can't process the dynamic alignment. And it requires a little bit of work to understand, in biomechanics, we'd be talking about arthrokinematics, right? Well, immediately the word itself scares the bejeebas out of most people. Arthrokinematics is too many letters. But thinking of what we're really saying is that there's all of these subtle motions that are happening in the body, like you talk about with shock absorption or reciprocal forces or ground absorption forces. The ability to move our extremities through space require a certain amount of dynamic organization in the body, the tensions and the compressions that happen, which is why I love where we're going as a profession in whole in movement, is really looking at fascia and muscle as being part of this dynamic tension and compression, and tied into the bones are all related, and they're going to be organizing themselves to have the proper tension and compression through that movement. That's dynamic. Dynamic meaning it's changing. It's changing every second, every microsecond. It's like it's a continuum of what's going on. And what I find is when the beginning movement instructor learns that true concept of dynamic alignment, it opens the whole world, because all those rules that often were, that we create for ourselves, like this is the plane of movement, and this is what this image has to look like. We have to get there, but we have to have core control, or we have to have a flat back, or we have to maintain the pelvis in this alignment. That interferes with normal human movement. And it even gets worse when we start trying to isolate muscles. Like, oh, you need to contract your left piriformis to do this activity correctly. It's like, well, nobody can isolate and do a contraction of their left piriformis. We know what it does, but do a volitional contraction of it, you might be struggling for a while. Maybe you can do it. Like I can lift up an eyebrow or those kind of things that, I can move a nostril, those things that I practiced as a kid. But for the most part, we are task-oriented. And I want to go there a little bit, Eric, of how you've worked to get your imagery. Like you've pulled in so many things from nature and other objects that match so well the dynamic alignment of the body. So, one of the things I remember very clearly was when we started working with bone rhythms in the lower extremity, and you said we might do a little bit of sampling of that. But it was such an eye-opener for me, because thinking of people who were in the class that were saying, oh, my Achilles is so tight, or my ankle doesn't go into grand plie. I can't go down in that position. I'm used to being up on my point shoes. And then we realized that, they weren't using their bone rhythm. So they were trying to spiral their pelvis out and their femurs out and their tibia out and their feet, everything out, because they were trying to be this 90-degree externally rotated ballerina in their plie, not realizing that, if you got a jar, the lid and the jar have to go in opposite directions. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about that, and just the idea of how bone rhythms is such an easier way to process, and an easier way to understand how dynamic our tissues are. And if we understand the image correctly, it facilitates correct movement, or I should say, more efficient movement. I won't say that's incorrect or correct, but more efficient and more effective movement in the desired task. And maybe we go there.
Exactly.
We do have a couple questions pending. Before we go there, this first question by Rosanna de Guzman. I don't know if you can see the Q&A up, Eric, but she asked a very good question, and I would love to get your 2 cents on this before we go into that next topic. But she said, what about a very successful baseball player with rounded shoulders? If his posture has worked well for his game, setting records in the sport, would you look into changing these rounded shoulders?
My fast answer to that, I don't know what yours is, don't change it. Don't change it.
Don't touch it.
Don't
Tell
touch
afterwards.
It.
Wait till he has a rotator cuff and an elbow subluxation, and then we can talk.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, there's potential, theoretically, biomechanically, there's potential in that posture for problems to arise, joint spaces, impingements, whatnot like that. But if it's working fine, you can have relatively bad posture, but practice your skills so much that within that not so good posture, you still become very, very good. You probably would be better if you'd have, better posture, but I think it would kind of mess up the patterns that have built up around that posture. It's part of him feeling comfortable in his body, having those shoulders. I would not change it.
Yeah. I agree. I would wait until he, hurts himself, and then we would sort of reprogram and give him a better than before, the bionic man. One other question here. Hugh said, what would you suggest for a young person around 13 years old whose spine has begun to want to reverse its in thoracic kyphosis? I'm wondering if it wanted to flatten, upper thoracic in particular. Their spine as a whole lacks much natural curve. So I'm thinking he's talking about having a flat, like a young teenager starts having a flat spine. Is I think what that question's kind of, is that how you would interpret that?
Yeah. I'm also not quite sure what it means exactly. So it's turned lordotic or flat?
More flat. So instead of having a natural kyphosis, I'm assuming that they're getting a real flat thoracic spine. Mm-hmm. And I'll take that one on if you want.
Yeah, okay, you take that one, yeah.
Yeah. I think, again, when we think of function versus what we see statically, I've been fooled so many times, and we really need probably like 5 or 6 segments in the spine that are really functioning well for most human movement, and we have redundancy of 23. And so even when somebody has a fusion, or they have an anomaly or a scoliosis, or excessive kyphosis, or a hypokyphosis, lumbar lordosis or hyperlordosis, to me, it's always about going back and looking at what they actually are able to do and where they do it from before I start getting concerned about the static posture that I might see or might present. And that's the same thing where, we used to make such a big deal about scoliotic changes, and I don't want to spend much time here, but when you look at the literature, the average human being in the Western world, 95% are going to have mechanical low back pain, and of them, 25% are going to have back pain for the rest of their life. And when you think of people with scoliosis, they have less back pain. So maybe we all want to have scoliosis so that we have less back pain. It's like, there's not a correlation of that spine alignment necessarily with function or with well-being until we really assess where those restrictions are coming from, how we then could improve maybe a little more mobility somewhere else or to restore something. And I think we do get caught up a lot in the aesthetic appearance of diverse postural adaptations rather than really looking at function. And so I know, Eric, you're a big fan of that as well, of just really looking. I think you said something that would apply to this, is that ideal posture is when our body parts come closer to the central axis as much as structure permits.
Or balance,
and so,
opposed to, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What was that? Something like that. Yeah. But it was like understanding that we're not all going to look like Kendall and Kendall's picture of a neutral spine in their book of the human anatomy, and that there is diversity, and that our ideal posture is where we can best function from with our structure. Now we can improve that, and that's where a lot of what Eric's work goes. We can go from there.
Exactly. Exactly. But I also would maybe add, and I think you kind of mentioned that the spinous processes, of course, very much mask the actual curve the spine has. So depending on the position of the spinous processes, the curve might actually be fine. And the second is, of course, movement. Movement is the best posture corrector, because what is the purpose of having good posture? It's having good movement. Posture is a moment during movement, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what it really should be, and not like we're not statues. So generally speaking, if you move, it's a great way to improve posture. I can give you just a quick example of that. So let's say you want to have better neck posture, lengthen neck. So you could say, okay, lengthen your neck, everyone, lengthen your neck, tuck your chin. And now from the outside, it would look, yeah, that looks like pretty good posture, but you feel uncomfortable, right? That's not good. And you feel stuck. And if you do something else, which is, working with movement, for example, touching the bone under your earlobe, which is the mastoid, and if you draw an imaginary line between your two touches, that's another form of feedback we were talking about, that's where the head sits on top of the spine. And then imagine the head seesawing on the top vertebrae, which is the atlas, very gentle, that seesaw. Yeah, relaxed jaw. So think of a seesaw, very easygoing seesaw, and just push up gently on the mastoid processes. Shoulders are dropping like that, and you're breathing. Good. And now, if you do that, wow, great head neck posture, but you feel mobile. So the suggestion is move with good function, with a good image of function. That's why in the Franklin method we say embodying function improves function, right? But embodying function also improves posture. So in the Franklin method, we like to improve posture through movement, because the goal of good posture is good movement. So that it's a result of good movement and not like a position like that. So to talk about the bone rhythms, you want me to talk about the bone rhythms?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and also you want to talk about presence. So let's first do that. One of the first exercises we do we have this warm up in the Franklin method. So it's a codified introduction structured to how to use your mind and, to improve the health and movement of your body. And so the first exercise we do is just 1 minute, feeling your body and not thinking about anything. So focusing, feeling your breath, feeling your posture, feeling your tension level, and not thinking about anything. And that's kind of hard for a lot of people to do. And it's especially hard to teach, because when we teach, we want to act and tell and inform and, do this, do that. And just to teach, let's just feel for a moment. And that is a huge, important prerequisite for improving anything. Because if you can't feel what you're doing, you can't improve what you're doing, because you don't know what you're doing in the first place. So that's kind of where it starts. And 30 years ago in my garden, when I still had a garden, I was thinking about what I was told, about the pelvis, that it's a square, and, everything's kind of square. And then I kind of looked at the pelvis and I was looking for the square. This is the original story. And I took something which is more square and I put it on the pelvis, and I saw that doesn't match at all. But what if I take this and I kind of like, match this with the pelvis? Then I can see the true shape of the pelvis, which is actually, as you can see, a spiral. So if you look at the pelvis, it's actually a spiral. You see, it's a spiral, like a wind chime. So it's a spiral, something like this. Of course, it's many other things as well. It's an arch. That's the first thing. All the limb bones are spiral. But the second interesting thing is, when I do a linear movement, but looks like a linear movement, like reaching for the camera inside my body, the bones are actually all doing counter rotations, doing spirals. Exactly. They're doing what I then termed the bone rhythms. And the classic bone rhythm to experience, the one you start with, is in the pelvis. It's very easy to feel. We'll just take 2 minutes for that. So put your hands on your ischial tuberosities, or as close as you can. And when you flex your hips, they're going to go out a little bit. And when you extend your hips, they're going to come in. So sit bones out, sit bones in. Sit bone's going to go out, sit bones in, sit bones out, sit bones in. And if you squeeze your sit bones together and don't let them move, then we can't flex our hip joints, or only with a lot of tension. So those sit bones are moving out. So I'll show it here with the pelvic model. So the sit bones are moving out like that when you go down. So there's a natural widening and opening of the pelvic outlet. And, we use that when we land from a jump, or when we sit down, or when we go to the toilet. And if you look at one pelvic bone here, this is the sit bone. So this is going to go out, but that of course means that the other side of the pelvis is going to go in. So what that means is, I'll show it maybe from this point of view, the pelvic half is doing a three-dimensional movement in space when we flex our hips. So the bone is doing a three-dimensional movement. And you can feel that, for example. This is going to be an interesting alignment experience if you do it. So you touch your sit bone on the right side, and you touch your ASS on the same side. So ASS, anterior superior leg spine, and sit bone. And then you shift your weight a little bit to that leg. And then as you flex, feel the sit bone go out, and the ASS is going to come in. And now the sit bone is going to go in. Can you feel that, right? And the ASS out. So sit bone out, ASS in, sit bone in, ASS out, sit bone out, ASS in, sit bone in, ASS out. You can brush your hands like that. So the spiral pelvic half is spiraling out and in as we flex and extend our hips like that. And after you do this, lo and behold, if you stand on the side we just practiced, you'll feel the lower back is more lengthened, the pelvis is more lifted. Then on the other side, you'll probably feel a little more sway back and more dropped in your pelvis. Can you feel the difference? So we just improve pelvic posture, not by positioning statically, but by moving with the bone rhythms like that. Want to quickly do the other side? Okay, sit bone out, ASS in, sit bone in, ASS out. And this goes on and on. And then we add in the femur. So if you want to touch your femur, when you bend your leg, yes, of course, the femur is going to go forward, but it's also going to do a little bit of an external rotation and then an internal rotation that's built into the structure of the knee. So it's not an opinion in the sense of, I think you should turn your femur out. It's built into the system. It's a natural movement. Thanks, Brent. So femur out, femur in, femur out, femur in. And then the question, is that the same or the opposite of the pelvis? It's the opposite. The two bones are counter-rotating. So femur out, pelvis in, femur in, pelvis out, femur out, pelvis in, femur in, pelvis out, femur out, pelvis in, femur in, pelvis out, femur out, pelvis in. And again, if you stand on your leg, you're going to feel lifted. Lower back is going to be more released. You're even going to have more hip flexibility on that side than the other side. And then you come to the question is, why is the body doing that? Well, think of me throwing this sponge at the screen. So if I would throw it just using one dimension, it's not very scary. But if I throw it using 3 dimensions, I'm going to have much more power. The same thing when you catch something. So if you use 3 dimensions to generate and absorb force, you can use you generate much more energy within the constraints of your body. So the body is using these 3 dimensions to create more force and to dampen, absorb more force efficiently within the constraints of the limits of our body. So making us more safe and efficient. And so if you statically align, you're going to block the bone rhythms.
Yeah.
But do the bone rhythms and you're going to improve your posture.
I think of, practices like parkour or Ido Portal, and you start realizing this 3-dimensional capacity that we have in martial arts, of course, Aikido, of being able to absorb and deliver and respond to forces, ground reaction forces that become so critical to, not only performance, but also safety, like you're saying. And there's a question that came up from Marth Valvidia, and basically saying that how long is it going to take for med schools and PT schools and even Pilates schools to get this incorporated? And we do want to be very clear that we've been incorporating Eric's interpretation of movement and the arthrokinematics in Polestar from the beginning. And I think that it's this is why we avoid words like holding or, maintain it in this position versus, allow and to observe and to think of things moving in opposite directions, or the spiral that Eric's talking about, because these are the natural bony structures communicating with the other bony structures in our body. It's how they work. And in medical school, we do talk about it as arthrokinematics. It's the biomechanics. And so even when you're looking at things like hip replacements, which I just had one 3 weeks ago, or you're thinking of a knee replacement, even harder to figure out the arthrokinematics of a knee. That's why I don't want a knee replacement, is because it's so challenging to get some of those natural arthrokinematics that exist in our body. And I think that for all of us, we need to be very much thinking of the natural movement that is inside of our body. And this is where, Eric's work has become so powerful. And I always suggest, read his book, take his courses, whatever we can do. And we try to incorporate the same idea in our teaching in Pilates and physical therapy, is that if we understand these elements of movement, we become so much more efficient. And I want to share a personal story of this morning. So this morning I was seeing Brian Beatty. He's my physical therapist here in North Carolina, also a Feldenkrais practitioner, a Tai Chi practitioner, specializes in endurance athletes, running, cycling, swimming. But it was like we spent maybe 45 minutes just working on reorganizing that spiral and finding the actual placement of my foot and ankle, and then the knee spiral and the femur spiraling over it as I shifted my weight. And then as I started to extend and come off, of how I could bring my hip forward, and really appreciating those bone dynamics. And it was amazing, because I'm 3 weeks out now from the surgery. And it just, that little bit of energy, there was no strengthening. He wasn't like trying to get my glutes or my, rotators strong, or my quadriceps strong, or my calf strong. It was just about getting the body to move through its proper alignment, now that I have a foreign body in my body, to be able to have that awareness. And so I can't tell you how fast the body starts gravitating towards, when it feels good movement, when it feels proper dynamics, it wants to be there. It wants to. That's the happy space for that knee and that hip. And it was amazing for me to feel what felt like incredible instability in my knee and ankle, and a new hip. It was like, I'm not familiar with my left leg right now, to actually go back to a place where I remember that. I remember that place. I feel that stability. I feel that control. And that's why this work is so valuable in what we do. And I don't want to diminish it in any way. I want to go this last little section here, Eric. We're about 15 minutes out. You want to comment? Go ahead and make a comment.
Show a picture of the bone rhythm, just a few slides, just for 2 minutes. This is just the bone rhythms of the leg from above, just very briefly. This is the spinal changes we talked about. Here I'm working with the dancer on the bone rhythms, counter rotations. There are bone rhythms of the foot right there. Bone rhythm.
That's what I was doing today, by the way.
Yeah.
What you just showed.
So I'm not going through this very fast. And then like some of the imagery for, dynamic alignment that we talked about. External cues and external imagery, internal imagery. And my upcoming courses right here as well.
And we'll be posting those courses, Eric, in the post-production. Yeah.
It's one of the first postural images I ever drew.
I remember that image.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember that image. So thank you for sharing that. I mean, this is, again, this is something that I'm not trying to fill you up with lots of compliments, Eric, but I think that this is one of your gifts that you have of creating imagery that's so practical to the organic nature of the body. And with it, you bring in the emotion. So I don't know if you looked at the expressions on the faces or in the bodies, or the energy that's coming out of the bodies in the imagery. But it's like when you study Eric's work, it's so powerful to think of that so much power and so much mobility and flexibility and capacity exists in our body that we're not tapping into, because we're limited to a strategy of only moving through L4, L5, or a strategy of making everything go through the knee or through the bunion of the big toe. You know, it's like we don't fully express the movement that is throughout our body. I wanna finish up, Eric, and I think that, you know, talking about perception and awareness and tying it in a little bit with the fascia, compression, and tension. But I want to, you know, it's like how does we play with our toys? We have lots of toys. How does that biotensegrity model? You've been doing a lot of work inside the biotensegrity model and myofascial work lately, and your writings and your teaching. Let's talk about that from a standpoint of perception and awareness in our body. We just did sort of that quiet, even like 10 seconds of just being quiet and listening to your body. But how do you see things now as far as being able to really capture, you know, proper awareness and perception, to teach people to have that internal locus of control, that I can hear and feel my body. I can tell when I'm not functioning well, when I'm, you know, imbalanced, and how I go back and do some of my exercises and movements to reorganize myself. And it's not always like, oh, I have to go get manipulated, or I have to go get stretched, or I have to have somebody treat me, because so much of it is like, just start facilitating the movement in your body and your body will respond. And that response is that alignment that we're talking about, that dynamic alignment. And not just, you know, when we think of, I always use the example of Hunism, the Polynesian sort of spiritual faith was that, you know, they would send the teenagers out into the wilderness, and they believed that you had a conscious spirit, a subconscious spirit, and the great spirit. But when your subconscious and conscious spirit were aligned, you were opened up to the infinite great spirit. Or if we think of the Akashic field in Hindu faith, of just this all-knowing, everything's there when we're present. Or a Christian and Judeo-Christian and Islamic way of like, when we're in tune spiritually, we have access to inspiration and creativity. We need to spend more time in that space. How do we get in that space?
I couldn't agree more. If there were a magic wand where like people would get that is so important to be present, that so much can be learned when you're not thinking, when you're just here and present. And, you know, people, yes, it's great to practice meditation and go to meditation camps, but if you don't have time, I highly recommend just this simple routine. And I'm going to have, in a month or something, I'm going to have a webinar myself on daily routines. And so one of the simple routines, 3 times a day, just practice 1 minute of being present, feeling, posture, breathing, and not thinking. And guaranteed in a week or 2, you'll already be better. Don't take too long. Just, you know, you're waiting for the bus, or, you know, you have a moment in the shower, whatnot. Just a moment being present. Of course, you can do also working with breathing and so forth. And then there's a few other interesting, this gets a little more out there. So the way you feel during the day and the way you experience.
We like out there. We like out there.
What?
We like out there.
Okay, you like out there. Okay, good. So the way you experience, okay, 2 things. The way you experience the world depends on very much on your postural state, the ease of your posture, dynamic posture. So, and there's research on it. We know this, even though it sounds pretty far out. So if you're in bad posture and you get news, you know, someone tells you, oh, did you know, you interpret it more negatively than if you're in better posture. So if you're going to have to deal with a lot of people saying things and like this, make sure you do your little posture routine. You know, we have neck sponging, shoulder, just like that. Get into your best, freest posture, and whatever people are going to say, it'll be easier to deal with. Second thing is, before you go to bed, ask for some nice dreams. So how you feel during the day is related to your dreams. So if you have a lot of negative dreams, freaky dreams, you know, like being chased by the bear, whatnot, which can happen, you know, then actually you feel less during the day. So literally ask, okay, let's have some nice, fun dreams. Like, you know, have you ever dreamed that you're flying? Okay. So that's the second day I was like, I ask for nice dreams. I get nice dreams. I feel better the next day. That was fun. You know, I could like fly over the landscape or something like that. Really fun. Yeah. And then the other thing is, we know, I know from experience, but I didn't know there was research on it until I started looking, that if you practice more imagery, sort of like we're looking at, so, simple stuff, warm water flowing down your back, releasing tension, shoulders melting, head floating up, your spine is just like, if you use more imagery in daily life, not just when you're doing your practice, you're doing your Pilates or your exercise, but just in daily life, going shopping, whatever, you are in a better mood. There's a relationship between using more imagery and mood. Use more imagery and worry less, because the imagery will replace all that. You're right. And every morning, ask yourself, okay, today I want to have some really nice imagery that spontaneously pop up in my mind, or I want my environment, external cues. I don't know, I see flowers or a tree like swaying in the wind. I'm like, oh, that's my spine. And I see leaves dropping down. I'm like, oh, those are my shoulders, or my, leaf floating in the wind. That's my shoulder blade. I do that all the time. Yeah. Like, oh, that's a nice image right there. I'm going to try that out in my body. So you do that, and actually it improves your general mood, especially if you're not, you need things to improve your mood. If you are not in a good mood, try posture. You're not in a good mood, reach up with both arms. I have a same on my hand, and just shake your arms as if you're cheering for yourself. You go, you're great. You're doing a good job. You're great. You're doing good. Cheer for yourself, just for yourself, not for anyone else. And those are all things that it's fine to do. It's okay. When you're in a better mood, it's not like egotistically taking time for yourself and you're doing these exercises. If you're in a better mood, everyone else will benefit too, right?
Yeah.
So work with your dreams. And if you haven't,
Eric,
do that.
I love that. I love that. And I know that, you are not exempt from the challenges of life and the world. And we've talked about that. Everybody has them, some of them more horrific than others. But it's like the tools that we use to cope with loss and challenges and those kind of things can make all the difference. And I think of the times that I work with patients that have severe limitations. I mean, severe limitations, whether amputations or fusions or head traumas. And some of them just have this incredible innate ability to find joy in their life. And it's a mindset. We've talked about the mindsetting. And others are, just unable to get out of their own way with a hangnail. Like the hangnail ruins their life. They can't pick their nose. They can't put a shirt on. Their life is ruined because they got a hangnail. And it's all perspective and perception. And I think that's what I love about this, is that our perception can shift our ability to be present. It can shift our ability to be happy and kind. It can shift our ability to be consoled when we're struggling and looking for comfort. And I think, like you were talking about, the imagery of, could I feel the comfort that I need? Can I imagine, even, a spiritual being hugging me and giving me comfort? Can I imagine the warmth of a blanket? Can I imagine the touch of a hand, or those kind of things that could ease my distraughtness? And I sort of want to go to that place where, we often talk about alignment of the physical body, but we're sort of on this edge of talking about emotion, and we're talking about spirituality. We're talking about psychology of the way we think, the way we process information, and to realize how empowered we are. And things that you've shown me is just like, again, walking out in nature and watching a tree sway and thinking, oh, that tree is very stable, but watch it sway. Or watching the leaves shake, and to think like I could just shake like the leaves and shake my body in the wind. And to be able to get rid of, maybe pesky birds or insects off of my arms that are pecking at me, or pain, and realizing how powerful movement imagery can be, not just for our physical body, but for every aspect of our being. And I really appreciate you bringing that. And there's nothing that's out there too far, Eric. I think that, Carol Davis always said, first it's witchcraft, then it's clinical practice, and then it becomes evidence-based. like don't be afraid of testing some of the witchcraft in the clinical practice, because eventually we might find there's these strong correlations
Mm.
between people that have this presence and awareness that actually are able to process life better, and they're happier, and they're able to deal with the stresses better just with something simple like that.
It's like aligning your environment to what you want, how you want to feel. And, one practice is just to rub your hands together for a moment. And then you just feel between your hands, so this kind of energy between your hands. There is energy between your hands. If you don't believe it, take your hand there and you notice there's nothing. And here's the energy. And then you give yourself a little self energy bath, and, throw away all the tension from your environment, right? Imagine there's a lot of smiling and happiness in your aura or your environment. So it's a great little bath you can do for yourself like that,
Yeah.
every morning. And then good old affirmation. So start and end the day with some nice words. Find a book that with like some things you read, like you're tired, and just first input, first few inputs during the day, yeah, to get yourself aligned with the best outcome. Don't start with anything random and negative or news or something like that. Just like align your body, and then of course there's the physical alignment stuff you can do, and freeing your diaphragm and all that. But the mental alignment, so
Yeah. Yeah. It's good stuff. And
Yogi
it's,
once said, if you have a choice between like cleaning your mind, first thing in the morning, or brushing your teeth, start with the mind. It's definitely a yoga kind of idea like that.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
absolutely, that's the way to go. And
Yeah.
practice being present, suddenly you'll have some nice surprises that it'll get better and better, and you'll make discoveries and you'll have insights you weren't able to have before. And I think there was one question I would love to answer. In the question, there was one
Do
about,
you go ahead?
visual person.
Yep. Go ahead with that, with
Yeah.
Irina.
So the thing is, so
Irina.
even if, most imaging, for example, imagining your spine is a spring, you could say, no, it's not a spring at all. That's kind of odd, or your shoulder blade is a leaf. Those are metaphors, we call them. And metaphors are always personal. You like them or you don't like them. So, your shoulders are melting like ice cream. No way, I have a dairy allergy. Like, doesn't work. So metaphors are very personal. You like them, you don't like, and that's why I always say to teachers, don't use the rote metaphors your teachers taught you. Find what works for your client. That we call that student-centered teaching, right? Discover what works for them. Everyone has an imagination. Let them be part of the creative process. So that's one answer. And the
Yeah.
second is, you always want to be able to corroborate the imagery used with science. So you can always say, we know as a fact that if you find the right image, it will improve your performance. It's one of the slam dunk things that improves performance. And usually I can corroborate the imagery I use, even the imagery that is like a little bit odd, with biomechanics. Like my sit bones are pendulums swinging out and in. That sounds really odd, but that's the bone rhythms, for example. So generally you can say, look, this is the biomechanics behind that image, even though it's a little bit odd. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, metaphors are personal. And one metaphor can engage so many fascial and muscular structures at once, because the brain figures out how to put it together in new ways based on that good image. That's what we're finding out with our Parkinson research. So if you find the right metaphor, it somehow goes around those blocked areas of the brain and finds new pathways to help that person get up from the chair or turn around. It's like magic.
Yeah. I was going to say also that a lot of us have our favorite collection of imagery,
Mm-hmm.
and we find out that it's not working with a particular client, and we sort of get frustrated and think, well, this person's really dumb or doesn't get it. But it's really we have to be so flexible. And I like your demonstration in the book, Eric, where you talk about the difference between direct imagery and indirect imagery, and the different types of indirect imagery. And we really have to be masters of doing that, because some people are very, I guess, sort of like what Irina's question was, very direct kind of imagery. Like she wants to see the bone probably, and to see how that bone moves, which is fine. So we would
This is great.
use
Yeah,
that
good.
type of imagery. Others are going to do better with nature, or others are going to be better with toys that they played with as kids, that they understand what a slinky feels like or a spring feels like. And I think that's important. I was just going to share one quick one. I was doing a meditation with a group, and one of my favorite things is filling up with warm water and melting things inside. And everybody was just about to fall asleep, and one person's like choking, and it turned out that she had a near drowning experience, and it was like very bad imagery for somebody that's had a near drowning experience. But I think that we need to be flexible as the practitioner, and it's just like when we teach. The university, I have kids that are visual learners, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners, visual learners. Yeah. They're all so different. And for us to be the best type of facilitators, we have to be flexible too in our tools and to think of how do we keep building our toolbox. And I can't emphasize enough to the listeners of this webinar that Eric Franklin has an amazing toolbox. For anybody that wants to teach movement and loves movement. Eric, I'm just so thankful for your contributions to our industry as a whole. I do want to bring up a couple things here. Eric is always teaching. He does a lot of things online that people can join. We're going to be putting his links on the post-production and the letter that goes out afterwards that everybody gets. We also have something really special to announce. So Eric is going to come out to the farm. We're going to do a Franklin method retreat with a little bit of Polestar in it. But Eric and I are going to do something together in the farm in North Carolina in the beginning, or actually the very end of May, beginning of June, 4 days. And Eric will be teaching a course, and then for 2 days, and then we'll have sort of almost more like a conference kind of style, retreat kind of style of having some lectures and demos, and then going outside and doing some movement together and exploration and activities that I personally am just super excited about. And we'll be sending out with this as well a link to Hold Your Space for those of you that might be interested in it. I think it's going to be amazing. It will be limited space. We're probably going to be somewhere around 50 to 60 people max. And knowing as many followers are of Eric that in the United States, and you haven't really taught here since COVID. Is that correct in the States?
Hardly, not
very little.
Shots, no, not really.
Yeah, so this is going to be a great chance to, if you're outside of the United States, come join us in North Carolina. If you're in the United States and you miss Eric and you haven't seen him for a number of years, come join us. It'll be sort of a reunion, retreat, education, exploration, relax, and come hang out with us. So looking forward to that.
Very much so. Very much so.
All right. Yeah. Well, Eric, thank you so much. Any last thing you want to say to the audience before we're good? Okay. All right. Well, listen, above all things, be present, be kind. Let's practice a couple of things that Eric showed us today, just very simply of having the posture of kindness and the posture of joy in our lives before we make any major decisions. And wishing you all a very wonderful weekend and good evening to you, Eric. I know it's late where you are in Switzerland. So again, thank you, everybody, bringing the world physical, emotional, and spiritual alignment. Thank you so much through movement. Eric, thank you again. Appreciate you all.